Today, we will be considering the nominations of well-qualified individuals to serve in the EPA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, Federal Highway Administration, and the Southwest Border Regional Commission, and we will also be considering the adoption of GSA leases, including $18 million for much-needed repairs at a federal building in St. Albans, Vermont. Let me very briefly discuss my concerns about one of the nominees up for consideration, Joe Goffman, who has been nominated to lead the EPA's Office of Air and Radiation. I have nothing against Mr. Goffman, and I hope and expect that he will do a very good job in the position that he has been nominated for. What I am concerned about is the implementation of a provision that I worked on with Chairman Copper that was included in the Inflation Reduction Act to provide the EPA with $7 billion in federal funding for zero-emissions technology. The legislative intent of this program is to make it more affordable for low-income and working-class homeowners to install solar on their rooftops and save money on their electricity bills. And by the way, when we do that, we create hundreds of thousands of good-paying jobs. If this program is implemented properly, it will provide solar to more than 2 million families in the United States over the next 2 years and catalyze up to 10 million residential solar installations over the next 10 years. Unfortunately, since President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act in August, I have been unable to get a firm commitment in writing from the EPA to implement this program consistent with the clear legislative intent. The $7 billion program was not put into the Inflation Reduction Act for nuclear, electric vehicle charging stations, or any other type of energy. It was included in this bill primarily to expand residential solar and reduce the energy bills of millions of low-income and middle-class families. So let me be clear. I will be voting for Mr. Goffman in this committee, but I will not support his nomination on the Senate floor until I receive a commitment from the EPA in writing that it will implement this program primarily to expand residential solar throughout this country. And I want to thank Chairman Copper for his leadership on this issue and look forward to our continued work together to expand residential solar, lower the cost of electricity for consumers, and combat the existential threat of climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Sanders, I'm pleased to be able to work with you and your team.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to take this opportunity to say a few words not only about the negotiations between railroad workers and the railroad management, but also to put that crisis into a broader economic context. Mr. President, it seems clear to me, and I think the polls indicate it, that the American people are becoming increasingly disgusted by the corporate greed they are seeing and experiencing every single day. They look out around them and they see 3 people on top owning more wealth than the bottom half of American society. They see corporate profits soaring while the prices they pay for the products they need continue to go up. They see CEOs of major corporations now making 400 times more than the average worker at that corporation. They have seen during this terrible pandemic, when tens of thousands of workers died because they had to go to work, they have seen the billionaire class make $2 trillion more in their wealth. Further, they look around them, and while the very wealthiest people in America become much richer, they walk down the street and they see people sleeping out on the sidewalks. We got almost 600,000 Americans who are homeless. People can't afford their health care costs. We had 85 million Americans who are uninsured or underinsured. In other words, the economy is doing really, really, really well for CEOs and billionaires. But for the average American worker, he or she is falling further and further behind. Now, within that broad context of what's happening in the overall economy, let's take a look at what is going on in the rail industry today and why Congress is being asked to implement a union contract with rail workers to avoid a strike that could take place as early as December 9th. And it turns out that when we talk about the extraordinary level of corporate greed in America, there is no better example of that than what is taking place in the rail industry today. They are the purest example of why the American people are so angry at what's taking place in our economy. So if you look at the rail industry today, what you will understand is that this industry has seen huge record-breaking profits in recent years. Huge profits. In fact, in the first 3 quarters, not a whole year, 3 quarters of this year, the rail industry made a record-breaking $21 billion in profit. Further, they have so much money, profits are so high, that the industry spent over $25 billion this year not to improve rail safety, not to address the supply chain crisis, but to buy back its own stock and hand out huge dividends to its wealthy stockholders. In fact, since 2010, and I hope every member of Congress hears this, the rail industry has spent over $183 billion on stock buybacks and dividends. And on top of all of that, the CEOs of many of these railroad companies are enjoying huge compensation packages. So while workers struggle, last year the CEO of CSX made over $20 million in total compensation. The CEO of Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern made over $14 million each in total compensation. In other words, within the rail industry, corporate profits are soaring and CEOs are making incredibly large compensation packages. But in the midst of all of that, it is fair to ask what is going on for workers. Profits record-breaking, CEOs tens of millions of dollars a year in compensation. What's going on for the workers in the rail industry? And the reality is that the key issue in the rail dispute that we are dealing with right now, votes taking place as we speak in the House, is not about salary. It's not about how much money workers there are earning. The key issue is the working conditions in the rail industry, which are absolutely unacceptable and literally beyond belief. Right now, if you work in the freight rail industry, and this is a job in the rail industry, this is really hard work, dangerous work. It's work that takes place when it's 20 below zero. If you are a worker in the rail freight industry, you are entitled to a grand total of 0 sick days. Let me repeat that. You are entitled to a grand total of 0 sick days. Now, as a nation, industry after industry, government after government here in Congress, our people get sick. They have the right to take time off. It's humane. Nobody, not the most conservative member of this institution, would say to a worker, oh, you got COVID, you're fired. It would be unthinkable. And yet, what this means, the policy in the rail industry means, is if you get sick, if your child gets sick, if your spouse gets sick, and you need to take time off of work, not only will you not get paid, you actually will get reprimanded, and could get fired. And that absurd, inhumane situation is precisely what is taking place today in the rail industry. Mr. President, let me remind you and all of our colleagues that hundreds of Americans are still dying every day from COVID, and tens of thousands are being hospitalized as a result of this terrible virus. What the freight rail industry is saying to its workers is this: it doesn't matter if you have COVID, it doesn't matter if you are lying in a hospital bed because of a medical emergency, it doesn't matter if your wife has just given birth, it just doesn't matter. If you do not come into work, no matter what the reason, we have the right to punish you, we have the right to fire you. Frankly, it is hard to believe that these conditions still exist in the United States of America in the year 2022. Let me give you just a few examples that I am familiar with hearing from workers. One rail worker was penalized by the railroads for spending the day in the hospital with his son, who was having breathing issues. Another worker couldn't take his pregnant wife to the doctor because it could have resulted in disciplinary action for him. Tragically, we witnessed the death of a locomotive engineer who was forced to skip his doctor's appointment after experiencing unusual symptoms, only to suffer a heart attack and die in an engine room weeks later. And here is what one rail worker recently said, and I quote, "I am tired of being tired all day, every day, and having every one of my coworkers being physically sick from sleep deprivation. Most of my coworkers can't stay awake anymore during a 12-hour trip," end of quote. That's one rail worker. Mr. President, there is absolutely no reason why these workers should have to deal with these conditions in the richest country in the history of the world. And I wonder, Mr. President, if the CEOs in the railroad industry or other top executives in this industry, I wonder if they get fired when they don't get into the office because of sickness or when they have a medical emergency in their families. So I think in fact, the head of the Teamsters recently said this, Sean O'Brien, that, what's good for the CEOs in terms of paid sick leave is good for employees as well, and I think he is absolutely right. Further, I should add, as everybody knows, that quite sensibly the federal government guarantees 12 weeks of paid family and medical leave to its workers. So if you are an employee, for example, at the Department of Transportation in the United States of America, sitting behind the desk, you are appropriately guaranteed 12 weeks of paid family and medical leave. But if you are an engineer running a train with tons of freight behind you, you get 0 sick time. Now, that may make sense to somebody, but it does not make sense to me. As a result of this incredibly reactionary policy of denying workers sick time, rail conductors, engineers, and other rail employees are coming into work sick and exhausted, which is a danger not only to themselves, but to their coworkers and everyone else who is around them. The work they do is dangerous work. Mr. President, the United States, sadly, is the only major country on earth that does not guarantee paid sick days, something that we hope to remedy. We tried to remedy, and we've got to continue going forward so that we do remedy it. It is a bit of an embarrassment that of all the major countries on earth, we are the only one not to guarantee paid sick days. In Germany, workers are entitled to as many as 84 weeks of paid sick leave at 70% of their salary, depending upon how serious the illness is, and countries all depending upon how serious the illness is, and countries all over the world, in one way or another, have generous policies that recognize that in a modern, civilized society, if you get sick, if your kids get sick, if your wife or husband gets sick, you are entitled as a worker to have paid sick leave. But while government workers here in the United States and in many, many industries, many companies, guarantee their workers paid sick leave, rail workers in the United States of America today, in the year 2022, are guaranteed 0 paid sick days, 0. Now, the rail industry has told us that they can't afford to provide paid sick days to their employees. Instead of sitting down and negotiating with their unions to bring about a reasonable compromise, for the past 3 years, the rail industry has refused to agree to a single day of guaranteed paid sick leave to its workers. They say it would cost too much money to provide their workers any paid sick days. Well, let's see. They made over $21 billion in profits so far this year. They provide their CEOs with huge compensation packages. They spent $25.5 billion to buy back their own stock and hand out huge dividends to their wealthy stockholders. But they're just too broke, too financially hard-pressed to guarantee paid sick days to their employees. So here is where we are, Mr. President. Interestingly enough, it turns out that guaranteeing 7 paid sick days to rail workers would cost the industry a grand total of $321 million a year, a tiny fraction of the $21 billion in profits that they have already made. If the major rail carriers can afford to spend $25.5 billion a year on stock buybacks and dividends, do not tell me that they cannot afford to guarantee paid sick days to their workers and allow these workers to have a reasonable quality of life. But, Mr. President, the outrage over the lack of paid sick leave is not the only issue that rail workers in America have been fighting for. The rail workers of this country are sick and tired of unreliable scheduling, which is having a negative impact on their personal and family lives. In America today, rail workers are on call for up to 14 consecutive days, 12 hours a day. In fact, it is not uncommon for many rail workers to be on call nearly 24 hours a day, with a requirement to report to work within 90 minutes for shifts that can last nearly 80 hours. Now, Mr. President, as you know, last September, President Biden and Labor Secretary Walsh worked with the rail industry and union leaders to come up with a tentative agreement that was better than what the rail industry had been offering. But this agreement still does not require the industry to provide a single day of paid sick leave to workers. I thank President Biden and Secretary Walsh for their efforts, but Congress can and must do better. And that is why I will be introducing legislation to guarantee paid sick days to every rail worker in America. And I will insist on a roll call vote in the Senate on this legislation as part of any unanimous consent required to vote on the tentative rail deal. Now, Mr. President, I hope very much, and I think we may, have bipartisan support for this modest legislation. And I would hope, and I've talked to Republicans who indicate that they are prepared to support the workers, but I would say to every member of this body, Democrat, Republican, that think long and hard about how you go home to your constituents and say, I voted against allowing rail workers in this country 7 paid sick days. Go home and think about how you're going to explain that vote. And Mr. President, let's be clear. It's not just the rail unions and Bernie Sanders who believe that working conditions on the railroads with no guaranteed sick leave is wrong and inhumane. It turns out that that view is shared by some of the railroad's major business customers who are seeing a decline in the service that they are receiving and that they need. Let me quote from a recent op-ed by Eric Beyer, the president and CEO of the National Association of Chemical Distributors, who wrote an op-ed entitled, "Railroads Should Give Workers the Benefits They Seek." And here is what Mr. Beyer wrote. And again, this is a business organization that wants to make sure that their product is delivered on the railroads in a reasonable period of time and on schedule. And Mr. Beyer writes, quote, "To say the paid sick leave policy for rail workers is woefully inadequate would be an understatement. The negotiated agreement does not include any significant measures to improve quality of life issues. Rail workers today have 0 time allotted to them by their freight rail employers for sick leave. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, private sector workers receive 7 to 8 days of sick leave per year. A fragile and volatile supply chain requires a strong rail network. Now is not the time to deny reasonable benefits for a labor community that has been decimated by losses in recent years. It's time for the freight industry to right this wrong and get rail back on track," end of quote. That's from the chemical distributors, an important customer of the railroads. And it's not just the chemical distributors. And I want people to hear what the chairman of the Surface Transportation Board, Martin Oberman, had to say about the horrendous working conditions in the rail industry at a conference with rail executives earlier this month. And here is what Mr. Oberman said, quote, "When railroads try to excuse their failures by pointing to labor shortages at other businesses, those other businesses did not enter the pandemic having stripped themselves of nearly 20% of their workforce in recent years. Today, the railroads tell us they are still having a hard time recruiting and retaining workers and try to blame this on the Great Resignation. The fact is the railroads' personnel practices made these jobs much less desirable," end of quote. According to Mr. Oberman, the railroad industry has slashed its workforce by 10% since the pandemic started, slashing some 13,000 jobs. And he continued, again, this is Mr. Oberman saying, quote, "Class 1 rail companies over the past 2.5 years saved roughly $4.8 billion in payroll. During the same 2.5 years, the Class 1 rail companies have returned nearly $60 billion to stockholders in stock buybacks and dividends, more than 12 times what they saved in payroll. Might the shareholders have been satisfied with only $55 billion in buybacks and dividends? Apparently not. $4.8 billion in saved payroll would have been a drop in the bucket, but the operating ratio had to be met," end of quote. So what he is saying, and what I think many of us understand, is the railroads are making huge profits. They have seen their profit margins nearly triple over the past 20 years, and during the last 6 years, they have reduced their workforce by 30%. You want to make more money? That's the way you do it. You cut back on your workforce. And now they are in a situation where they're telling workers, if you get COVID, you're going to get fired. So clearly we need to rethink the entire business model of the rail industry. But right now, the issue before us is not complicated. And that is that in an industry which is enjoying record-breaking profits, an industry which laid off 30% of its workforce in the last 6 years, an industry which gives its CEOs huge compensation packages, now is the time for that industry to respect its workers and treat them with the dignity that all working people are entitled to. So, Mr. President, we are in an important moment, not just for the rail industry, not only for rail workers. The issue is whether or not this United States Senate will join the House, and my understanding is that the House just passed paid sick leave, 7 days. They did the right thing, and I want to applaud the members of the House for doing the right thing. And now it's going to come here to the Senate. Do we stand with workers in the rail industry and say, yes, you are right. Working conditions are horrendous. We cannot continue a process by which you have zero paid sick leave. Do we stand with workers, or do we stand with an industry that is making huge profits, pays its CEOs exorbitant salaries, and treats its workers with contempt? That's the choice that the Senate will soon be having to make. And I hope very much that in a bipartisan way we can do the right thing and tell the rail workers and tell every worker in America that the United States Congress is prepared to stand with them and not just the people on top who are doing extraordinarily well. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The side of working families who are struggling every day. She's on the side of raising the minimum wage to a living wage. She's on the side of making it easier for workers to join unions. She's on the side of saying that health care is a human right and that every person in this country deserves health care. She is on the side of making it clear that all of our young people in this country, no matter what their income is, are entitled to higher education, tuition-free at a public college or university. So that's what this campaign is about. Nationally, what the Republicans want to do is give massive tax breaks to the very, very wealthiest people in this country, and then cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Republicans are turning their back on the existential threat of climate change, which is going to impact not only Texas, Vermont, the whole world. So the choice in this campaign is pretty clear. The turnout is not going to be high, which means that every vote counts, and we have got to do everything that we can. If people tell you this election doesn't matter, tell them it matters big time which party controls the House or the Senate. And I'll give you one more example. I want you all to remember. A couple of years ago, we would not have had this rally because we would be in the midst of a terrible pandemic situation. All right? We all remember that. Remember thousands of Americans dying every single day. At that point, because Democrats controlled the House and the Senate marginally, we have 50-50 in the Senate, we wrote the American Rescue Plan. And I want you to remember what we did with that plan. In the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of a time when millions of workers were losing their jobs, we made sure that every man, woman, and child in this country had a check of $1,400. Remember that?
Yes!
All right. That's a family of four, $5,600. That kept families afloat, prevented people from getting evicted from their apartments. Now, we are being attacked for doing that, but I make no apologies for doing that. All right. Now, in the midst of that pandemic and massive unemployment, we extended unemployment benefits so that when workers lost their jobs, they had food on the table to feed their kids. In the midst of that pandemic, when hospitals were overflowing with COVID patients, some of them were on the verge of collapse, we put billions of dollars to strengthen hospitals. We made sure that every parent in this country got a check of $300 a month per child. Remember that? Does that matter? All right. That's what we did without one bloody Republican vote. It was expensive. Yes, it was expensive. It was worth it because we saved lives. We saved dignity. All right. Republicans have a different view. They want to spend their money by giving tax breaks to the rich and cutting programs for working families. That is what this election is about. We need Michelle in the Congress. Let us go out and knock on doors. Let's talk to our friends. Let's bring people out to the voting polls. Let's make sure Michelle is the next Congresswoman from this district. Thank you.
Good evening. No question about it. While we don't have the final results yet, yesterday's midterm elections turned out far better than people had expected, and you made that happen. Thank you. First, let me give a shout out to all those who came out and voted. Voter turnout was high, especially in some battleground states like Pennsylvania. Without that kind of citizen participation and voter turnout, John Fetterman would not have been elected to the U.S. Senate. Further, on a personal note, let me thank the over 14,000 people who attended the 19 rallies that we recently held in Oregon, California, Nevada, Texas, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Turnout was great and the energy level was high. Let me especially thank the young people who overwhelmingly came out to vote, not just for women's rights and gay rights and environmental justice and to protect our democracy, but who also understand that we must have an economy and a government that works for all of us, not just the 1%. While the turnout among young people is still not as high as we would like, there is no doubt that young people played a decisive role in this election. Young voters in Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, and Arizona supported Democrats by over 70%, landslide proportions, and played a decisive role in electing senators, members of Congress, governors, and members of the legislature. If there's anything that gives me hope about the future of our country, it is that our younger generation is the most progressive generation in history. This is a generation that has fought racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, and bigotry of all kinds. In America and throughout the world, young people have also been leaders in the fight against climate change and the need to take on the greed and irresponsibility of the fossil fuel industry. God knows that there are a lot of important issues out there. The issue of women's right to control their own body, the issue of the attacks on the very foundation of our democracy by right-wing extremists, the issue of gun safety, and many others. But at a time of massive wealth and income inequality, let me also thank working class voters and union voters for standing up against corporate greed and voting for candidates who have the guts to stand up to the moneyed and powerful interests. I was happy to see that in the last few weeks of this campaign, many candidates made it clear that they were prepared to take on Republicans who want to give huge tax breaks to the wealthiest people in our country and then cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And I thank all of those candidates who raised that very, very important set of issues. Let me also mention that last night was a great night for progressive candidates. Despite the huge amount of money spent by billionaires and their super PACs against us in support of right-wing politicians, there will now be more strong progressives in the U.S. House than ever before in modern history. And let me just name a few of them. Let me take this opportunity to congratulate Summer Lee on her resounding, strong victory in Pennsylvania's 12th District. Summer ran a great grassroots campaign and withstood an onslaught of outside money from billionaires. She will be a great congresswoman from Pittsburgh for the working families of our country. Congratulations also to Becca Balint on her historic win. Becca will be the first woman ever elected from my own state of Vermont to the U.S. Congress, and I look forward to working with her on behalf of Vermont's families. Texas, thank you very much for sending Greg Kazar to the U.S. Congress. I know Greg well enough to know that he will be a great leader in Congress, and I want to congratulate him on his great victory. Congratulations to Jasmine Crockett on her victory last night in the 30th District of Texas. Jasmine will be a much-needed voice for voting rights and for an economy that represents the needs of working families in Texas and throughout our country. I also want to congratulate Jonathan Jackson, an old friend of mine, on his victory in the 1st District of Illinois. Jonathan understands the need for racial justice in this country and for the need to create an economy that works for all. Congratulations to Delia Ramirez on her win last night. She has been a champion of working families and immigrants in Illinois, and I know that she will continue her fight for them in Congress. Congratulations to Val Hoyle on her win in Oregon last night. Val knows what it means to stand up for working people and fight for raising the minimum wage, passing paid sick and medical leave, and for workers' rights. And I very much look forward to working with Val in Washington. And last but not least, congratulations to Maxwell Frost on his historic victory in Florida's 10th District. Maxwell will be the first member of Gen Z elected to Congress, and I want to congratulate him on his historic victory. Now, I would not be telling you the truth if I told you that we won everything last night. We certainly did not. Some excellent progressive candidates lost, and we are still not sure at this moment whether Democrats will be controlling the Senate and even possibly the House. But no matter what happens in that regard, tonight I am asking you to please stay engaged. Please continue fighting for justice, economic justice, social justice, racial justice, and environmental justice. Last night, 58% of the electorate in the red state of Nebraska voted to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour. With your help, we can and must do the same thing in Washington for every worker in America. Raise the minimum wage to a living wage. Last night, a majority in the red state of Missouri voted yes to legalize marijuana. With your help, we can and must legalize marijuana in every state in our country. Last night, a majority in the red states of Kentucky and Montana joined the red state of Kansas in voting against ballot initiatives to ban abortion. With your help, we will codify Roe v. Wade and make abortion legal in every state in America. Last night, we beat back some very dark forces, and you made that happen. That's what happens when people stand up and fight back. But needless to say, the struggle is far, far from over. There is an enormous amount of work yet to be done. Let's do it together, and thank you all for what you're doing. Take care.
Further and further behind. And I want to say a word about this inflation, because Republicans are going around and they're saying inflation is a serious problem. It is. A lot of people are hurting. gas prices, food prices, drug prices, whatever it may be. What they don't tell you is what the causes of inflation are. They want to blame Joe Biden, they want to blame Bernie Sanders for inflation. Well, we have got to explain basic economics 101 to them. And that is, inflation is not just an American issue. In the United Kingdom, inflation is 10%, 2 points higher than it is in America. In Europe, it's 11%, we're at 8%. The causes of inflation are the pandemic and the breakdown of supply chain, raised prices. The causes of inflation are the terrible, terrible war, Russian invasion of Ukraine and all that that has done. But there is another cause of inflation which Republicans in a billion years will never talk about. And the major cause of inflation today, the reason why prices at the gas pump, in the grocery store are soaring, is because of corporate greed. If you want to know why you're paying high prices at the gas pump, ask ExxonMobil, who are enjoying record-breaking profits right now. If you want to know why food prices are high, ask the major food companies who have jacked up their prices to unconscionable levels. Same thing with the pharmaceutical industry. So take a deep breath and think about the morality of the issue. We live in a moment, because of this pandemic, a lot of instability in the country, a lot of uncertainty. People are hurting. You got the war in Ukraine, you got the breakdown of supply chains, and what corporate America is saying, not how can we help working people? How could we lower prices in this country to make things more affordable? What they are saying, the guy from ExxonMobil is pretty honest about it, this is an opportunity to raise prices as high as we can. And what we say is that is immoral, it is wrong, and that is why we are going to impose a windfall profits tax on those companies. I want to say this as well. Republicans go around and they're saying the cause of inflation is the large amount of federal spending with the American Rescue Plan. And as the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, I helped write that bill. So I know a little bit about it. Now, I want you all to think back 2 years ago. We were a country without vaccines. Thousands of people every day were dying. People by the millions were losing their jobs. Remember that? And what the President of the United States and what Congress did without one Republican vote is what we said is, you know what? When working people are struggling, when hunger in America is on the rise, when people are worried about being evicted from their apartments because they can't afford to pay the rent, you know what? Yes, we will provide $1,400 for every man, woman, and child in this country. And I don't apologize for that. And not one Republican voted for that. And when millions of people, because of the pandemic, lost their jobs, remember that? Unemployment went off the charts. We said, yes, we're going to extend unemployment benefits. And when working moms and dads were unable to provide for their kids, we said, yes, we're going to provide a $300 a month child tax credit for every child in America. And when some hospitals in America were on the verge of collapse because so many COVID patients were entering and their doctors were getting sick and their nurses were getting sick, we said, yes, we're going to spend billions to help hospitals care for sick patients. And we're going to help universities and public school systems survive the pandemic. So I apologize
to no one.
I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. At Thursday's Senate Health Committee hearing, Senator Bernie Sanders questioned FDA Commissioner Robert Califf. Sanders asked if Califf was concerned about the extremely limited number of companies that produce baby formula. Currently, 3 companies dominate the entire infant formula market: Abbott, Mead, and Nestle. The senator also asked how the FDA plans to prevent future shortages. Watch the entire exchange here.
Thank you. Senator Sanders.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Califf, concentration of ownership in our economy is a major problem in many sectors. It's true on Wall Street, it's true in energy, it's food production in general, and it is certainly true in the production of infant formula, which is so terribly important to millions of parents with babies. Right now, we have 3 companies, Abbott, Mead, and Nestle, who dominate the entire market. We have recently been discussing contamination at an Abbott facility. Tomorrow it could be Nestle. Are you concerned, and what are you doing about broadening the number of companies who are producing infant formula?
I'm very concerned, and as I said in my opening remarks, it's not unique to this industry that we're seeing concentration that puts everything at risk. And I'll remind you, as you well know, there is no requirement that companies show us their backup plans.
Right, but all I'm asking, and I've got other questions, is what are you doing right now to aggressively make sure that more companies are producing infant formula so we'll not see this problem recur tomorrow?
As you know, I'm sorry, Senator, to interrupt, but yes, on a temporary measure, we've lowered some of the, reduced some of the paperwork so that many more foreign manufacturers can import. We've got 26 applications since we opened the portal just over a week ago. The largest producer, Nestle, worldwide, hardly had any presence in the U.S., and they're going to help out quite a bit. They're very capable.
All right. I hope that you will focus on increasing the number of companies who are producing so we don't run into this problem again.
Yes.
Let me ask you this. On October 20th of last year, a whistleblower sent a 34-page report to the FDA describing in detail how the equipment in Abbott's manufacturing plant in Michigan, quote, was failing and in need of repair, and that the company knew that this was a problem for at least 5 years. According to this report, Abbott falsified records to cover up deficiencies at its plant, improperly trained employees, and successfully hid health and safety risks from FDA auditors in 2019. And even though this report was submitted to your agency last October, FDA did not interview the whistleblower until late December. Now, my question is, during that same period of time, Abbott saw a $7 billion increase in its profits, and its CEO, Mr. Ford, saw very substantial increases in his compensation packages. If a company lies to the FDA about its safety situation, at the same time it does massive stock buybacks, gives the CEO used compensation packages, are you going to fine them? What are you going to do to make sure the industry understands that you simply cannot lie to a government agency?
The whistleblower's complaint was received, and the usual staff reviewed it and did the interview. It was not escalated to the leaders of the FDA who were responsible, and that was an error that's now been rectified in terms of process. In terms of the status of the whistleblower complaint, I'm not in a position to comment on whether they may be legal proceedings.
No, what I'm asking is, I'm not even asking about the whistleblower complaint. If a major corporation lies to the FDA about something as terribly important, the safety of infant formula, what are you going to do? And at the same time, they do billions in stock buybacks, huge compensation packages for its CEO. Is the government, is the agency going to say, sorry, it is more important to protect the babies of this country than to give huge compensation packages to your CEOs? Are you going to stand up to them?
Senator Sanders, we are standing up there. As I said, I'm not in a position to say whether criminal proceedings are underway or not.
Is that something in consideration?
I'm just not in a position to comment on.
Well, I would hope that manufacturers of baby formula, which is so terribly important to parents and obviously the babies, understand they cannot lie to the Food and Drug Administration, and I hope you are strong about that.
Well, Senators, you know, I've worked on all sides of this. I've been inspected, and everyone understands when you lie to the FDA and you get caught, there's going to be big trouble.
Well, I hope there will be. Thank you.
Senator Collins.